So we're just going to kind of delve a little bit more deeply into some of the specificity of the role and responsibility of the vestry, especially as it's explained in the canons of the church. And then I'm going to pull in some language that comes from the chancellor of the diocese when he talks a lot about kind of the larger duty of the vestry and borrowing on the best practices that we find in the secular world on boards of governors or boards of directors of for-profit and nonprofit corporations. Many of those principles apply to the work of the vestry. And again, oops, there we go. So the powers and responsibilities of the parish. I'm sorry, let me move my icon so I can actually read what I have in front of me. Everything that you need to know is found in the canons that are listed on the screen of both the Diocese of Western North Carolina and the canons of the Episcopal Church. Now, you do not have to be like the bishop or me and carry this book around with you all the time, and you see how thick it is. You could be much more efficient and go to the diocesan website, and under part of our governance, and as well as under resources, we provide you with PDF links to both our diocesan canons as well as the canons for the Episcopal Church, so that you can then read the relevant canons. As members of the vestry, this is something that is you're invited to do and required to do, so that you really see yourself within the full context of the church. One of the resources that I will email everyone who has signed up for this class is the Vestry Leadership Resource Manual or Handbook, and it will go into a lot of this in more detail. All right, and I see some questions coming on, and I will get to those as soon as I get a chance to get through this PowerPoint presentation. And yes, we will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Some of you already asked that earlier. So one of the first things that the vestry is responsible for is managing the temporal affairs. And what we mean by this is, as it's stating in front of you, things concerning your property and the management of non-worship related affairs of the church. So we're going to talk a little bit more about property. This includes the land that your church sits on, the building, any of your other assets that you as a church are responsible for stewarding. It is the responsibility of the vestry to elect wardens. Wardens have a unique role in that they are to work alongside the priest in charge or rector to help manage the day-to-day responsibilities of the parish. So your senior warden will have authority with the vestry and in the parish, most especially when your church does not have a rector or a priest in charge. The warden is the one to make sure that the meetings are happening, that worship is happening, would be the person to connect with me and Bishop Jose in the interim period when there's no priest there. It is our primary point of contact in the church. So the vestry is responsible for electing lay leaders among the vestry to work alongside the priest and then to work alongside the bishop. You are to elect a secretary. The secretary does not necessarily have to be a member of the vestry. Many parishes have a secretary so that for continuity's sake, they can stay on past a 3-year term. But they can be a member of the vestry. The secretary is the one who not only takes the minutes, but attests to and make sure there is a recording of all of the important activities of a vestry. So they can preserve the record of the life of your parish. And then the vestry is also responsible for overseeing the policies, programs, and the budget. Now, these particular items are not stated explicitly in the canons, but in order to maintain worship, in order to maintain and steward your property and your resources, having policies in place ensure healthy stewardship, and they ensure healthy relationship, which ultimately is what we're called to. Is the mission of God is restoring all things to reconciliation with God. That's the mission, to steward love, to steward justice. And so making sure that the people that are gathered in your congregation are being equipped and empowered to do that ministry. And then a budget is the financial resources to do the mission, to go out and to proclaim the gospel, to equip and empower people for the work of following Jesus. So those are some of the key areas that the vestry has in terms of managing the temporal affairs of the church. The vestry is also called to support the diocese. I mentioned just a second ago that this is really all in the realm of stewarding relationship. So being a part of the Episcopal Church, we are not Congregationalists. So this financial support to the diocese, as well as leadership support. So we need people from across the diocese to participate in the governance of the church, the diocese. So identifying people to participate, supporting the diocese financially is one of the symbols of this relationship. Plus, it equips and empowers you all to do some of your work. So the money that is given to the diocese, we steward on your behalf so that we together can do mission in Western North Carolina. The vestry is also to assist in worship. Now, I want to be particular here in one way. Certainly, clergy might create worship committees, but in this particular case, the canons read that the vestry is to assist in keeping order in the parish during worship. So certainly, if you think back to earlier times when the canons were written, the idea that people might have been in and out and kind of some of the chaos and disorderliness that had often been found in worship within the sanctuary, in order to let the priest do the sacramental liturgical component, you need other people making sure nobody's acting out. And so this doesn't mean that you are bouncers, but it's to keep an eye on the church, to make sure that we are doing this with reverence, with care for one another, and how that gets played out in your particular church context is the kind of conversation you all should be having. What does it mean to hold the order during the worship? One of the most important things that a vestry will do is to call a priest and to manage the relations with the clergy in the parish. The bishop is going to unpack this more later after the budget presentation. But we're not a congregational church, so we don't cast a vote to the whole congregation of which priest is going to come and serve you. The vestry often will have a discernment committee. This is a collaborative responsibility with the bishop. So priests, again, vestries cannot just simply post a position and call a priest without working in collaboration and getting the consent of the bishop. But this is really the responsibility of the vestry in partnership with Bishop Jose, and it looks like he wants to say something.
No, just to be clear, because I think people get confused, that's any priest.
Yes,
Even if your parish is a larger parish and it wants to call an assistant, no priest can be called to serve in the diocese without the permission of a bishop.
And this, of course, also applies to deacons. And then this piece here that you see on the screen, manage relations with the clergy. So again, this is where the vestry is to connect with the priest and to not only work with them together mutually about the mission and the program and ministry of the congregation, but when there is conflict with a priest, the rector, the deacon, it's first the priest's responsibility to work through that conflict, but when it's untenable or it starts to get harder, this is when you start to slowly fold in the wardens and then eventually the vestry to manage those relationships. Again, we're not a congregational church, so this is an important aspect of the role of the vestry. And then finally, annually, having reports. I had the privilege of serving for a year in the middle of seminary at Canterbury Cathedral. And one of the most fascinating components is to go in their archives and to see the over 1,000 years worth of documents that they keep, obviously in very secure and air-controlled region of the cathedral basement, because you get a snapshot of what the values, the hopes, the dreams, the mission of the community at a particular time in history. And so providing and preserving these reports on an annual basis, you are preserving the mission of your particular congregation. And so to review what particular community committees or areas of ministry at your parish are doing on an annual basis, and then collecting them and preserving them. Now, those are all of the responsibilities of a vestry. I want to talk a little bit about the limitations on the role of the vestry. So the bishop mentioned earlier that authority is shared, and the vestry does not have any more authority than the priest or the bishop. And so there's key areas for you all to know what those boundaries are of responsibility. The first is ecclesiastical matters. The bishop is responsible for all things ecclesiastical, and the bishop can jump in here if he wants to unpack that a little bit more. I'm going to give my best shot on this. This in particular revolves around liturgy. It involves oversight of clergy, in particular key areas as demonstrated in canons. So if a priest is found or is brought up on boundary violations or other things as demonstrated in the canons, the bishop, as well as another canonical body that helps oversee that discipline process. Worship, the life and care of clergy. Am I missing anything, Bishop Jose, there for ecclesiastical matters?
The only addition would be, for instance, if there was a desire on the part of a congregation to have their priest removed, to quote unquote fire them, that's not an authority of the vestry, and that's still a matter of the bishop, and that's a process that involves working bishop along with the vestry and the priest if there's in fact a decision that maybe it's time to move on. But that can't happen simply in isolation with the vestry. Only the bishop can allow that or be part of that, because as we'll talk about later this afternoon when I make my presentation, churches can't fire a priest. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But in those matters of two. So if there's in fact a conflict that is arising and it leads to a conflict which cannot be resolved between clergy and vestry, then I as the bishop am the one that serves in determining and making the decision of dismissal, separation, and that's a whole process.
Thank you. So another area, so yes, there, bishop is the chief pastor of the diocese. I guess that's also incredibly important to know that all clergy serve and are essentially discharged to our duties by the bishop. We are sent on his behalf. So there's that collaborative, mutual relationship. The ownership of property. So we talked about the role of the vestry having the authority to steward, to oversee the temporal care and the management of property. However, there are a couple of limitations on what you can do with that property. So essentially, every parish holds property in trust for the Diocese of Western North Carolina and the Episcopal Church. So while you have the authority to manage it, to determine how high you want the grass to grow, and you also have the authority to manage the interior of your property, of course, depending on your own policies, your internal church policies. So if you want to change out the bathrooms, you don't need diocesan permission. But there are extents to when you start to need permission of both the bishop and the standing committee. So the first is, let's say you want to build an expansion, or so you want to secure a construction loan, or you want to secure a loan to purchase property. In order to encumber the property through a loan, you need the approval of the bishop and the standing committee. And there's a process for that, so that it's an extra set of eyes to make sure that the parish doesn't get in over their head with a loan that they can't make good on. Because ultimately, if at the parish level, somehow you default on the loan, guess who end up holding the loan? The bishop and the diocese. And so this is a way that we want to make sure that you have reviewed your fiscal capacity to manage that loan, and that this is something that will not also be a burden on the parish, and that you really thought through that. Conveyance is, if I'm understanding this, is when you want to sell property. So because a parish holds property in trust, you can't just sell it again without the authority of the bishop, the consent of the bishop and the standing committee. Again, it's just another way of ensuring that you've thought through your mission. Isn't there and asking the deeper questions, is there a possibility of using that property down the road? Might there be a way to harness that asset for future mission or even present mission? And so it's asking those deeper questions, and you're not just selling property to meet the moment's budget. Bishop Jose, you want to add something?
And so the alienating that she just talked about, the alienating of property, selling anything is one. And then the conveyance as well. The other part of that people forget is literally if you want to transfer, convey property to, say, a not-for-profit, as often churches will do. They have a piece of property or land, and they're going to partner with not-for-profit and maybe even perhaps the city or county for a project. That still requires the approval. Anytime you're disposing of any property, and anytime you're taking on additional property or additional debt. Again, and it'd be the same thing, just so you know, at the Episcopal Church level, at the diocesan level, for us as a diocese to do some transactions and to either sell property or purchase has the same approval process at the diocesan level, and the same rules apply. If the diocese defaults, then the Episcopal Church as an entity is essentially held liable. So it's kind of this process of, it kind of rolls up, if you will.
And the last piece here, you see the word transfer, and this is if in the case where someone in your congregation, as we want, it's lovely when they put in their estate that your parish is going to receive some beautiful piece of property and then give it to the church. Just the idea is we want to make sure that in the receiving of that property, either in an estate or while someone is alive, that we're not hindered or burdened with a piece of property that actually will cost you more money to manage, or it restricts your mission and ministry.
I'll give you a quick example. And this is not in this diocese, but in my previous, where I was canon of the ordinary, a church received a piece of property from someone that was donated, but it was designated to be a garden for the town. And the church didn't do their due diligence, and then they ended up taking all the bills and all the requirements of maintaining a public space to be used by this town. And so what turned out to be a gift of land, they ended up being restricted. They couldn't sell it. And on top of that, they had to then provide it and pay all the maintenance and upkeep to preserve it as a park or public space for anyone in the town.
All right, specifically, there's some areas that will be helpful for wardens, and there's two key areas for your review. So again, it's working alongside the rector, especially in the absence of a priest or the rector or priest in charge, to attend to all of the business, if you will, of the vestry. And so they would preside at a parish meeting. They would also preside at vestry meetings in the absence of a priest. They need to keep the train going when a priest isn't there, working with the bishop's office. And then the next item is that they will assist with worship. And so in the canons, the wardens are to provide the elements for the Lord's Supper traditionally. Of course, that duty is transferred usually to an altar guild or to some other mechanism to make sure that the bread and the wine are present. But in the absence of an altar guild, and in certain small churches, it's the senior warden that needs to make sure that the bread and the wine are present and ready to go for worship. So here are the obligations of vestry members. And in some ways, these are these best practices that we find in the not-for-profit or for-profit world of a board, that leadership body. And the invitation here is to take these seriously, because it will set you up for not only faithful ministry, but it also gives you a measure of protection, because to grossly disregard any of these could hold you liable or the parish liable down the road. So let's go through these. So the first is duty of care. And by this, we mean that as vestry members, you come prepared for vestry meetings. You read your minutes, you read your financial statements, you pay attention to the agenda. It also means that you're paying attention to the life of the congregation. Do you know the people in the pews? Now, this is, of course, easier if you're in a smaller parish than it is in a larger parish, but collectively as a vestry, are you paying attention to the life of the congregation? Are you also paying attention to the life of your wider community that your congregation sits in? Are you paying attention to the ministries, the programs that are equipping and empowering the rest of the congregation for ministry? So it's this duty of care to pay attention, not just in the exercise of a vestry meeting, but also the life of the congregation. Duty of loyalty, this is that you are paying attention that your personal interests are not overriding the interest of the congregation or the church or the diocese. And so it means that you will always be paying attention to conflicts of interest. Now, there are opportunities where you could conceivably be, your company might be hired to mow the lawn, but it's the disclosing of that conflict of interest and that transparency so that the entire vestry knows that it's your company that's hired to mow the lawn and that you have abstained from that decision, or perhaps you have put somebody else in charge. It's the full conversation around where is their conflict, and that as a member of the vestry, you are putting the care of the parish above your own personal agenda or interest. The next, Bishop Jose, did you want to add something?
No, just to say, and economic gain.
And economic gain, yes, that you are not using your role to further your financial gain. Duty of obedience, this is the sense that you will abide by the boundaries, the rules, and the canons that guide and govern who you are as a vestry and who we are as a church and a diocese and part of the Episcopal Church. So there isn't this flagrant disregard for the structures and the polity of who we are as a church. So there's this obedience to participating in who we are as Episcopalians. And then finally, the duty of confidentiality. And by this, I am not saying that we disregard transparency, because that's also a great value. But within the confines of the business of the church, and when you gather as a vestry, there's an understanding that at key moments, you are honoring confidentiality and not breaking the conversations you have, so that you can have truthful and honest debate as a vestry. And then once a decision is made as a vestry, you speak with one voice. So if you make a decision that you are going to have a community garden, and there might be a dissenting voice in the vote, you don't then leave that vestry meeting and say, well, I didn't vote for that. And did you hear what someone said at the vestry meeting? So you're breaking the confidentiality of the process of who shared in that debate, and that you are honoring the process of having that, the different voices in the conversation. So yes, you will be transparent about the decision of the vestry, but you will hold carefully and confidentially the conversation that got you to that decision. All right, just a couple of other things. The first is business methods and church affairs. Carol Tannenbaum, the CFO, is going to talk about this in more detail when she talks about her presentation about the finances. This is, again, a very thick book, but you can find it online as a PDF, so you can read through it. This will give you all of the best business practices that apply to who we are as a church. In particular, many of the business practices around finances. Model bylaws. We provide a set of model bylaws for you to take and read through and read the notes presented and provided by the chancellor. If you don't have a set of bylaws, or it's time for you to update your bylaws, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and I can send you all of these documents. This is a way to provide for a goodly order or goodly process for the way that you organize yourselves at the local parish level. The size of your vestry and the terms. So again, setting what that looks like. There is a canonical at a diocesan level that you cannot have less than 5. So you need to have more than that. The terms of a vestry are set by canons. It's 3 years, and then you have to rotate off before you can come back and serve again. But your size, you could have more than 5, obviously. The eligibility to serve on the vestry. You have to be a communicant in good standing. And again, Bishop mentioned this earlier. But essentially, you need to be someone who is invested in the life of the community. So to be a baptized and one might also hope a confirmed member of the Episcopal Church. And the reason why that's important is you are saying, this is the church I want to belong to and be in relationship with my bishop and be in relationship with other Episcopalians. And so again, that goes back to the duty of care and duty of loyalty and duty of obedience. But you're also someone who shows up for worship regularly. You're someone who participates in the financial health and well-being of the congregation. So you give yourself, you pledge to the diocese financially. So we say communicate in good standing, and I just try to unpack what does that look like and why those things are important. And as a vestry member, you show up for your vestry meetings, that you set that as a priority and you mark it on your calendar. Usually it's the same evening of the same day of the month. And so that you show up and you hold each other accountable for that. that is kind of all I'm going to go through. Back to the business methods in church affairs, we did email you all a document that was prepared by the chancellor. And on that last page, as I'm holding it up here for you, there are several key components that are really critical. One is that your treasurer is bonded. So read the document. Someone in your parish vestry get a copy of business methods in church affairs, and at least begin to familiarize yourself with what's in there. All right, Bishop Jose, I'm going to stop sharing this so that we can then answer questions.
One thing I'll say real quick while Canon Augusta looks to see what questions are there. I've been asked before, so adult, communicant, in good standing, you could in fact elect an 18-year-old to serve on your vestry. And I share that with you because I think often in conversation with some churches, we encourage them to recruit folks who are younger, who often want to participate and be a part. And I definitely push that, and we talk about that when it comes to search process, that we should always look to get younger voices when we're looking or calling our next priest. So just know that in North Carolina, 18 is an adult. And so our canons do say adult, communicant, in good standing. So just know that, yes, a 18-year-old can run for vestry.
So one of the questions, Bishop, is does a person have to have been pledging to the church to be nominated for the vestry? Again, do you want to unpack communicant in good standing? Oh, I can. Oh, you're coughing. Sorry. So again, yes, according to the canons, part of being a communicant in good standing is that you are known to the treasurer, that you are giving to the financial well-being of the congregation. Whether or not technically that's a pledge, so as long as you are giving to the congregation in some capacity for the ongoing health and vitality of the congregation, that's sufficient. So it doesn't say, if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't say technically you have to pledge.
And that's a tricky situation. And vestries have gotten, some of the biggest debates I've been a part of over the years in ministry is vestries who said, we all need to sign a letter and say that we're tithing. And that causes issues. And they say, we need to send a letter saying that we've at least submitted our pledges first, as an example. You know, I would say to you, it's sort of like, you know, your belief in the church and parish and its mission and ministry, you know, where your money, there is your heart. Part of it is the vestry needing to create an environment of stewardship, whatever that's like. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, because that's part of leadership versus management. And there's a difference. And we're going to unpack that later this afternoon. Those are two different responsibilities of a vestry. And so I would say one of the things that every vestry should do, and I'll talk about it again this afternoon, there should be a covenant. Vestries should establish a covenant of how they expect to function together, how they are going to conduct themselves, how they're going to respond to the needs of the congregation. And so we have, for instance, at the diocesan level, I created a communications policy and a covenant that we use with standing committee and diocesan council, just to remind us of what it is that we're doing. And so that would be a good thing to get into practice. And part of that covenant can be an honest conversation about stewardship, because everybody has a different version of it. I happen to push the whole concept of proportional giving, because I think sometimes it bears out that if you say, I'm going to give 10% of my monthly income, you're ultimately going to do better than those who say tithe, because if somebody's salary or something gets impacted, they lose a job, people tend to say, I can't make the $60 a month payment. And then they stop making a payment and then they disappear. And I'm sure we've all been through that. Whereas if you say, no matter what my income is, it's 10%, and it goes with the ebbs and flows of people's income, you tend to get more participation. But that's another conversation for another day. But the point, though, is that I think part of your work as a vestry, and when you have your first initial meeting or retreat when you begin, that's an important conversation I think you should all have, is not only how you're going to conduct yourselves, but how do you look at the issue of stewardship and how are you going to model that? And there's no right or wrong, but there should be some skin in the game, as we say.
All right, we've got a couple more questions, Bishop. So the first one I'll try to handle. What is the difference between the secretary and the register? or are they the same? So I'm wondering if you mean clerk, secretary and clerk. So a secretary could simply be the person on the vestry who is making sure that minutes are happening and signs off that the minutes were taken. But a clerk might be actually the person who's taking the minutes. If I haven't answered that question accurately, a secretary is canonical, a clerk is not, but oftentimes we get those terms confused or we equate them for the same thing. Another question is, where does the discernment committee fit into the vestry in calling a priest? A vestry puts together essentially a subcommittee called a discernment committee and gives them certain role and responsibility and authority to do most of the work to bring to the vestry final candidates for the vestry to do the final calling. And the way we do it here in our diocese is that discernment committees are to bring more than one final candidate to the vestry. So the vestry then can do the last phase of discernment around which of the final best candidates would be the best priest in charge or rector. Hope that answers that question. There is a good polity question. What makes a church an Anglican church? And why are they called instruments of unity, Bishop?
So, so Anglican has often been thrown around a lot, and people say, well, they'll either say we're, sorry, there's like allergies or something kicking in. They'll either say, well, we're not Anglican, we're Episcopal. Or you're Episcopal, we're the Anglican. Now, some of that definition about Anglican comes from this whole troubles and struggles of the church to claim we're more the traditional Anglican part of the church than you are. And that's happened when there's been splits within the Anglican communion. The Anglican church as a whole is this birth out of the Reformation, what became the Church of England. And Anglican in a general sense is essentially, we're not Protestant and we're not Catholic. We're kind of the middle road. It's the via media. And so our liturgy and our practices are rooted in our Catholic, Roman Catholic tradition, but then also at the same time, our theology moved more towards the Protestant Reformation. And so we have the balance of our Catholic heritage, this Protestant, but we're not a Protestant church per se. So we're Anglican, we're that middle way between. And so often when you see the term Anglican, we're Anglican too. I could easily put the Anglican Diocese of Western North Carolina, and it would be in fact true. Could put the Anglican Episcopal. So Anglican in the strictest sense is that larger understanding of who we are theologically, liturgically. And then some communities have adopted the Anglican title who have left to sort of say, we're the true Anglican. We have not left our roots as that Episcopal Church has. But the Archbishop of Canterbury still recognizes the Episcopal Church as the valid part or province of the Anglican communion. And then the four instruments of communion within the Anglican community, these are the things that link us. So one is the Archbishop of Canterbury is one of the four instruments. The Lambeth Conference, which I mentioned earlier, which the Archbishop calls individual bishops by invitation only. The Anglican Consultative Council that I mentioned, which is that body made up of clergy and lay from around the communion. And then the primates meeting. Our primate, Michael Curry, the head of the Episcopal Church, and all the archbishops and heads of the provinces of the communion. So those are the four that we essentially say we refer to as the worldwide instruments of communion. And so that's what ties us together. Does that help? Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did. I have two other questions. Actually, I have three, but two are connected to the bonding of a treasurer. I am going to save those two questions for when Carol is with us after our break, because she's really going to be able to explain, is that required and how do you do that? So I will save those questions for Carol to answer after we come back from the break. And another question was, and I think this is actually helpful for everyone to hear. When a vote is being taken within the vestry, does the rector have a vote?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. The rector is part of the vestry. The rector chairs the vestry. And I'll talk about that later this afternoon, but yes, absolutely yes.
Now, you might have clergy that while votes are taken, don't say anything as a personal choice of how they lead, but technically they can vote on every matter before them. You cannot bar a rector or a priest in charge from voting on voting on issues that come before the vestry. They are full members of a vestry.